guys, welcome to your second online math lesson. So I'm still trying to iron out all of the difficulties of getting the videos to not show a restricted message. So for this week and possibly into the future, I'm going to be recording the sessions prior. Hopefully you can tune in and watch them during that 9 to 10 block as if they were going live, and then I will still be available 10 to 11 for office hours if you have questions and need assistance. So let's get into today's lesson. We are going to be covering lesson 26, which starts on page 270. You'll see behind me I have my poster written up. We're going to be talking about two things today in the same chapter. So we're going to be talking about measurement and line plots. So before we get into the lesson, I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about measurement. So you'll notice that on my poster here I have a giant ruler that I've drawn. And and there's a few points that I also want to bring up that are important no matter what we're measuring and no matter what the units of measurement are. These kind of guidelines will always apply. So the first one says always line up your start. So whatever you are measuring the end of it, so the starting end, with the end of your ruler or zero. So all rulers are a little bit different. Some of them, like the one that I've drawn, don't have a zero written. The first number is 1 and then it continues on. My ruler only goes to 6.5 inches. Some rulers have a little bit in from the end of the ruler and it starts with a 0. So you'll have to pay attention to the ruler to make sure that you adjust where the starting place is if it has 0 written. Most rulers do not have that. Most rulers do count the end as 0, but I have seen a few that have just that little incy bits of difference there. But for the most part, what you will want to do is you'll want to line up the end of your ruler with the end of whatever you are measuring. So for example, on my giant ruler here, if I were to take this pencil and measure it, now understand that my ruler is not drawn to scale, but if I were to take this pencil and I were going to measure it, I would line it up with one end at the end of my ruler, and then I would see where the other line would, where the other end would fall on my ruler. So that's the first thing, is making sure that you are starting your measurement at the end of your ruler or 0, whichever one. If there's not 0, then mark it with the end. Number 2 says check your units of measurement. So most rulers have two sides. They'll have a side marked with standard units, and they'll have a side marked with metric units. So we have, my ruler here is just in inches, but most rulers have one side that has inches, and then the other side will have either centimeters or meters. Or I'm sorry, centimeters or millimeters, not meters. So you want to make sure that you are using the correct side. How many times, I can't tell you, I have gone to measure something with my ruler only to discover that I'm measuring it with centimeters and I meant to measure it in inches. So it is important. Your units of measurement are really important. And we've talked a little bit about how important keeping the label is on whatever you are writing. So if you are dealing with volume, measuring it in terms of cubic units. If you are measuring it in terms of length, measuring it in inches or feet or miles or centimeters, millimeters, meters, whatever the unit of measurement is, you want to make sure that you're comparing them, because all of them are a little bit different. We talked in our recent book, The Phantom Tollbooth, they had all the different ways to get to Digitopolis, which really amounted to the same thing. It was just that the units changed, so it would take a lot more inches to get to there than it would miles. Really, it's the same distance, but it just depends on how much you are measuring it. All right, the third point says measure to the nearest quarter, half, or whole inch, and you round up to do that. So that's what we're going to be covering in this lesson, is rounding to the nearest quarter, half, and whole inches. Depending on what you are measuring will determine how precise you want to be. If you are just curious about how long something is, it's okay to round up in your measurements. If you are measuring something to cut, like for example, if you are sewing and cutting some fabric, or if you are building something and cutting some wood, it's really important to be as precise as possible. And with both of those, you also have to allow some for, in the case of woodworking, what the saw is going to take away, and in sewing, what the seam allowance is going to be. If you don't know what either of those things are, that's okay. It's just to say that measuring is important, and it's important to be as precise as possible when you are using measurements. But for today's intents and purposes, we are going to be measuring to the nearest half, quarter, and whole inches. To do that, if it's not quite to one of those increments, we're going to be rounding up to the nearest, whichever one is closest. If you go ahead and turn to page 270 in your book, you will notice that there is the first problem. It says that Rosa is following directions for putting charms on a bracelet. She places her bracelet along the ruler and completes step 1. What will Rosa's bracelet look like when she is done? So I would highly recommend drawing this out as we do it. You'll notice in the book that Rosa's bracelet, that her ruler starts with 0, so it's not quite at the very end of the ruler. There is a little part that goes in, and it starts at 0, and she has one end of her bracelet is at the 0 mark, and the other end reaches all the way to 3 inches. The directions are up at the top, and it says step 1, place a heart at 1 inch, and you'll notice that she's already done that. She's placed the heart charm at the 1 inch mark on her ruler. Now, what I want to also point out before we get going too much further onto that problem is that oftentimes you'll also notice with rulers that they have measurements that have the numbers on them, but then there are also lines that do not have numbers on them. Those represent fractional pieces of an inch. So from the distance from the end of my ruler, or 0, to 1, we'll notice has 1, 2, 3 lines, but it's divided. If we look at the space in between, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces in between. So really, my inch is broken up into fourths, or 4 equal pieces. Most rulers are usually down to 1/8 of inches. For today's lesson, since we're only going to be measuring to the lowest increment being 1/4 of an inch, I only drew 1/4 inches. But that is another thing to be aware of on your rulers, is that some of them only represent 1/4 inches, and some of them represent even smaller denominations. My clue would be, instead of counting the lines, counting the spaces in between to see how much of your inch is broken up into a fraction. So remember, just like dealing with fractions, we're looking at the inch as the whole, and then how many equal pieces it's divided into. So each of the lines represents a break of where the next part would start. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 equal spaces in between the end of my ruler and 1, but there are only 3 lines. So it can be a little deceptive that way. So if I were looking at my ruler here, I would say that this first one is 1/4 of an inch. The next one would be 1/2 of an inch, or 2/4. We know from our work with fractions that 2/4 and 1/2 are equivalent fractions, meaning they have different numbers, but they mean the same thing. They have equal value. And if I were to ignore these other two small lines, we could see that the 1/2 inch mark is halfway between my starting place and 1. So I have 1/4, 1/2. Then on the other side, if I were to count by quarters, I would have 1, 2, 3/4. So that's my 3/4 mark. And then I have my first line, which would be 4/4. Now, the difference with a ruler versus fractions is that the next lines we are going to be counting on from the whole number that we have already reached. So in this case, my first lines have to do with the fractional pieces between 0 and 1. 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and then 4/4 or 1. If I count beyond that, I still have that 1 inch in there. So now I'm dealing with 1 and 1/4, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 3/4 before getting to 2. After 2, it will be the same thing. I'm going to count the 2 inches that I already have plus any fractional pieces. 2 and 1/4, 2 and 1/2, 2 and 3/4, 3, and so on. So the important distinction with measurement and fractions is to remember that you have the whole number has how many inches you've already counted, plus any additional fractional pieces in there. Okay, so let's look back at the problem. So it says step 2 is to place a square at the 2.5 inches, at the 2.5 inch mark. So we would want to go onto our ruler, we would find the 2, we would find the 3, and then that line in the middle of both of them would be the halfway point between 2 and 3. That would be 2.5. So in your books, if you can find the 2 and the 3 and the line that splits them exactly in half, that is where we're going to be drawing a square on Rosa's bracelet. Step 3 says place a diamond at 1/4 inch. So now there isn't a whole number in front of it. So we know that we're somewhere in between 0 and 1. 1/4, remember, on my ruler is that first line. And on Rosa's ruler, we'll notice that she has it split with 0, 1, 2, 3 lines, and then 1 hole. So that means between 0 and 1, there are 4 equal pieces. So that first line is going to be the 1/4 inch mark. That is where Rosa would put her diamond, or where you would draw a diamond in your book. Step 4 says place a circle at the 1 3/4 inches. So we have 1 where the heart is, and then we would want to count on 3 of the smaller lines. 1, 2, 3 would be 3/4. That line just before the 2 is where the circle would go. So we've kind of talked about a little bit about all of the things that are explained in questions A through H. So I'm not going to take the time in this video to go over each of those, but I would encourage you all to go through them, especially if you have questions, just to make sure that you can find where each of those pieces goes on the bracelet. On page 271, they have a different way of looking at it. You can think about your ruler as a number line. Remember, number lines can go on infinitely, and they can also include an infinite number of denominations in between. So just like our rulers, we can have a whole bunch of fractions between 0 and 1. And so you can think about it in terms of, just like we've done with fractions, thinking about it on a number line, if that's helpful. I kind of feel like rulers are number lines, so I don't really think of it as being a separate thing, but the book is showing you that you can think of it that way, that it's just kind of a different representation. All right, number 1 at the bottom of 271 where it says reflect says describe how to find the 1 1/2 inch mark on a ruler. Again, I'm not going to take the time to go over this question together, but I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and answer it, come back to it and answer it in your own words for clarity. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn the page to page 272 because remember there's two parts of this lesson. There's the measurement part, but there's also the line plot part. So on the problem on page 272, says that Brian is measuring the lengths of 6 earthworms. The earthworms he has collected are shown. How can he find the length of each earthworm? So he has earthworms that are stretched out, labeled with letters A through F. So you can picture it. He says you can use an inch ruler to help you understand how to measure length. So there are worms A, B, and C above the ruler in your book. And it says this ruler shows half-inch marks. So you'll notice that in between 0 and 1, there is only one line. So the distance between 0 and 1 is cut just into 2 equal parts or cut in half. So that first line is going to be 1/2. So if you were measuring on that ruler, you could only measure to the nearest ½ inch. Down below, you'll notice that this ruler shows 1/4 inch marks. So you can measure to the nearest ½ inch. So again, just like my ruler up here, if we had these small lines taken out, my ruler would only be measuring in increments of 1/2, which would mean that I would have no choice but to measure to the nearest 1/2 inch. Since mine is broken up into quarters, I can measure to the nearest 1/4 inch. So let's use the same example of that pencil. If I were to hold it up to the end, I would see that my pencil is right about to the first line after the 2. And I know that between 2 and 3, there's 3 lines or 4 equal parts, meaning that that first line is 1/4. So my pencil would measure 2 1/4 inch on my made-up ruler. Now, of course, this doesn't measure 2 1/4 inches. It's a lot longer than that. But on my ruler, that's where it would be. Now, if I did not have 1/4 inch marks, I would round up. So it's a little over 2 inches. So I would round up to the nearest ½ inch. And I would say that this pencil is about 2½ inches. So that's what I mean about being precise. The smaller your fractional pieces of your ruler, the more precise your measurements can be. If you didn't have any fractional pieces, you would have no choice but to say, okay, well, this is really closer to 2 than it is to 3, so I'm going to say that it's about 2 inches if I were measuring to the nearest ½ inch. But generally speaking, if you're looking for which one it's closer to, if it's over, then you're going to measure up to the next fractional piece. Okay. Down below it says model it. You can use words to describe how to measure length. I don't find that particularly useful. For me, measurement is really about looking at it in terms of what it looks like. All right, on the next page, 273, we're going to go ahead and go through the problems together. So number 2 says complete the sentence to describe how you begin to measure earthworm A. I line up the left end of the earthworm with on the ruler. So we talked about how when we're measuring, we're going to line it up with either the end of the ruler or 0. So look at the rulers that are shown with the earthworms in your book. If there's a 0 there, then you would say, I line up the left end of the earthworm with 0 on the ruler. If there is not a 0, you would say, I line up the left end of the earthworm with the end of the ruler. Now, there is a sentence clue here in that it says with on the ruler. So it doesn't say with the end of the ruler, it says with on the ruler. So that tells us that we're going to write in 0 there. We're going to line up the left end of the earthworm with 0 on the ruler. Number 3 says, look at, picture it. Is earthworm A longer than 1 inch or shorter than 1 inch? Well, on the other page, I can see that there's a little dotted line marking the end of where earthworm A ends. and it goes past the 1 inch mark. So we're going to say that the answer to number 3 is that it's longer. Earthworm A is longer than 1 inch. 4 says the mark on the ruler that is closest to the other end of the earthworm A is what? So if we were to look at the mark that's closest to it, we would see that it would line up very closely with the 1 1/2 inch mark. So that would be what we would write in for number 4, and so number 5 would be earthworm A is 1 1/2 inches long. Number 6 says use the rulers and picture it to measure earthworms B, C, D, E, and F, and write your measurements in the table. So I'm going to let you guys go ahead and fill that information in on your own. Please note that earthworms A, B, and C are going to be measured to the nearest half or whole inch. But earthworms D, E, and F will be measured to the nearest quarter, half, or whole inch. So it's important to know that there's going to be a little bit of a difference there, just because the rulers that you're using are different for each set of worms. Number 7 says explain how you found the length of earthworm F. And I'm going to let you guys go ahead and do that after you fill in the table. At the bottom of the page it says try it. Brian finds 2 more worms. He labels them G and H. What are the lengths of the worms to the nearest half an inch? If you have a ruler at home, you can go ahead and measure them as well. I think hopefully that's what, because I don't know how else you would do that. So if you don't have a ruler at home, you can skip those. Okay, turning the page to page number 274, we're going to go ahead and change gears for a second and talk about line plots now. So I'm going to just move my poster up a little bit. So now we're going to be talking about line plots, and line plots are when you gather data together. So we talked about data last time and how we make different types of visual representations with our data. The example that I have here is number of pets, and a line plot is a way to show frequency, how many times something occurs. In this instance, they're also going to be showing measurements, but on your line plot, you have a number line at the bottom, and then you're going to represent the frequency of times that that number shows up with X's above that number. So for example, I'm not using fractional pieces in my data. My data says number of pets. You can't have a fractional pet. You can only have whole pets. And so I did an informal poll with some of my friends to see how many pets each of them has. So I have 2 pets. So I'm going to go ahead and find on the number line 2. This is representing the number of pets. I'm going to title it down here, number. Oh, that's not great. Let's try a real pen. All right, so I'm going to give it a title, number of pets. And since I responded that I have 2 pets, I'm going to mark 1X. So one of the responses was 2. I'm going to find the 2 on my number line and write an X over it. That's going to represent my piece of data. So I'm going to write a little check mark to remind myself that that piece of data is accounted for. The next one down, my friend Sharon, she also has 2 pets. So I'm going to once again on my number line find the number 2, and I'm going to draw an X above that X that I already wrote in for myself. So now we have 2 people represented by the 2 X's that have 2 pets. Okay, my third friend, John, he has 2 pets as well. So I'm going to write another X, a third X, over the 2. Because remember, the 2 is representing the number of pets So I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 pets. So far, 3 people have responded that they have 2 pets. So I have 3 X's over the number 2. Now Angela, she has 3 pets. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the 3 and mark an X over the 3 for her 3 pets. So far, our data is showing that we have 3 people who have 2 pets and 1 person who has 3 pets. And I have been forgetting to cross off my information. Now my friend Ashley, she doesn't have any pets. So I'm going to go over to 0 and I'm going to write an X for 0 as the number of pets. So Ashley is the person here who has 0 pets so far. Check her off. Now my friend Erin, she has 6 pets. Sound like somebody you might know? So I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to the other end of my line plot and mark 1X for the 6 pots. Now notice, 6 pets rather, not pots. Now notice that I'm keeping my X's kind of in a line, so I'm stacking these vertically on top of each other, but I'm trying to keep them kind of in a similar line instead of one being up here and one being down here. I'm trying to keep them all kind of on this imaginary horizontal plane so that I can see how they stack up together. Okay, so that's Erin's 6 pets. Now my friend Melissa, she also doesn't have any pets, so I'm going to mark another X over my 0 for 0 pets and cross her off. And my friend Zoe, she only has 1 pet. I'm going to go over to the 1 and mark an X. So you'll see in our line plot now that I have 2 people who have 0 pets, 1 person who has 1 pet, 3 people who have 2 pets, 1 person who has 3 pets, no people in my data sample who have 4 pets, and no people who have 5 pets because neither of those have X's above them, and 1 person who has 6 pets. All right, so if we get back to the questions in our book, now we're going to go ahead and look at our problem on page 274, which is similar. It's related to the problem that we had on the previous page, in that Brian recorded the lengths of his earthworms in this table. So you can compare your table with Brian's table as a way to double check your answers. If you haven't already filled it in, though, don't cheat. All right. He wants to make a line plot of the measurements. What will Brian's line plot look like? So he has the table written down below. Beneath it, it says model it. You can use a number line to help you begin to draw the line plot. So just like my number line, I looked at the spread of my numbers and I said that I start as 0 and I go up to 6. And so I labeled my number line 0 through 6. But on the model it problem on this page, you'll notice that it goes from 0 to 3, and it has a line, number line that's divided into fractional pieces. And the reason for that is because we're going to be showing the frequency, how many times an earthworm has the same measurement. So you'll notice that it has 0, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4, 2, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 3/4, and 3. You'll also notice on this number line that it has 2 arrows, one that says shortest earthworm and one that says longest earthworm. So you have quite a few numbers before the shortest earthworm. You could, in theory, start your number line at 1 because there aren't any earthworms that are shorter than that in our sample set. Sorry, it's almost 8:40 and it's been a long day, so I'm stumbling over my words, but you guys are probably used to that by now. All right. And then where it says the longest earthworm, we have one number that goes beyond that. So on my number line, my highest number was the end of my number line. Depending on your data set, you may have a number line that's really broad and has a lot of numbers in between, or you might want to narrow it down. So in the book, they've chosen to give some of the numbers starting at 0 going up to 1 1/4, but you could, in theory, start it a little bit closer to where your shortest earthworm was. Model it says you can also use models to help you display the data. So the table shows how many earthworms there are of each length. This is similar to like a tally chart. You could use X's or you could use tallies. X's are similar to how you would display it on a line plot in that you're using X's on the number line. So in this table, they've used X's to show the number of times that that earthworm has the same length or the frequency that it occurs, but you could easily, just as easily display it with tallies as well. All right, on the next page, on page 275, it says complete the scale on the line plot number line below. Use a scale of 1/4 inch. So you'll notice that they have already written in for you the numbers 0 and 3. So you know that your number line is going to be between the numbers 0 and 3. So they also have 1 and 2 written in for you. So you can also see that there are going to be fractional pieces. So the fractions that would divide up the number between 0 and 1, there are 3 lines, as we talked about on my ruler up here. When you have 3 lines, you really have 4 spaces, right? You have the first quarter, halfway, 3/4, and then the full 4/4 or the whole. So if we were to label them, we would have 0, 1/4 on the first line, 1/2 on the next line, 3/4 on the third line, and then 1. Now remember, when we are counting up measurements, we will add on the 1 with whatever the additional fractional pieces are. So we notice that there are also 3 lines in between 1 and 2. We're also going to be breaking those up into 4 equal parts, because remember, 2 is going to be like another 4/4, or in this case, if we had 4/4 and another 4/4, we would have 8/4. So we have 1, and the first one after 1 is going to be 1 1/4. The next one would be 1 1/2. 1 3/4, and that brings us up to 2. Now we have 3 lines in between 2 and 3, so we're going to use the same principle and divide it with 2 1/4 on the first line, 2 1/2, 2 3/4, and finally getting us up to 3. Question 10 says, how many worms did Brian measure? So we'll have to go back. We see that he has A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. He measured 8 worms. So the answer to 10 is he measured 8 worms. 11 says there will be an X on the line plot for each earthworm. If 2 or more earthworms are the same length, the X's will be drawn one above the other. How many X's will be on the line plot? How many worms did Brian measure again? 8. So how many X's will you have on your line plot? 8, because each X is going to represent the length of 1 earthworm. All right, number 12 says, how many worms are 1 1/4 inches long? 1. So draw an X above the 1 1/4 mark. You're only going to draw one X because there is only one worm that has a measurement of 1 1/4 inches. Number 13, how many worms are 1 1/2 inches long? There's 2 worms that measure 1 1/2 inches long. There's worm A and there's worm G. They both measure 1 1/2 inches long. So you're going to mark how many X's above 1 1/2 inches? 2, because there were 2 earthworms with that same measurement. Number 14 says, complete the line plot. Make sure to draw an X for each earthworm measurement. An easy way to double check after you mark all of the X's for all of the earthworms is to go back and count the number of X's and make sure that you have 8 for all 8 earthworms. Number 15 says, explain what each X on the line plot stands for. You should write in something that says each X stands for 1 earthworm, or the length of 1 earthworm, or the measurement of 1 earthworm, however you want to word it, but each X stands for 1 worm. Okay, Number 16 says to draw a line plot of the data in the table, start by choosing and labeling a scale. So they've given you plant lengths. That's the title at the top of the chart. They have plant A through H and the corresponding lengths in inches underneath. They're asking for you to go ahead and draw to create a line plot. So you'll need a separate piece of paper for this, or you can maybe squeeze it in at the very bottom, but it's pretty tight there. I would recommend getting a sheet of lined paper if possible to write your number line on. So the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to look through my table and see what is the smallest measurement there. And I notice that 5 3/4 is the smallest measurement that's shown. So I would recommend starting at least at 5 3/4 inches. I don't think you need to start at 0 because that's going to be a whole lot of number line that is not getting any use. So there's no problem in starting your number line closer to 5 3/4 inches. You could start it at 5, you could start it at 5 1/2, you could start it at 5 3/4, but I wouldn't start it anywhere after 5 3/4 because that is the smallest plant length that you have. Now I'm going to look through and find the largest plant length so I know how high to make my number line. So there's 6 1/4, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 3/4, 6 1/4, 6 1/2. So I know from my scale up here that 1/2 is less than 3/4 because 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. So I would say that the tallest plant length here is 6 3/4 inches. So I would make my number line go at least to 6 3/4 inches. You might want to just round it up to 7. So you could have your scale be between 5 and 7. That would make for nice whole numbers at both ends. But again, I would not start any higher than 5 3/4, and I would not go any lower for your end point than 6 3/4. So you could start with those, and then you could mark in your other markings, or you could just start with your first one and create more even markings that way until you get to your 6 3/4 or 7 mark. After that, I'm going to look through and I'm going to notice, oh, there are 2 plant lengths that are 6 1/4. There are 3 plant lengths that are 6 1/2. There are 2 plant lengths that are 5 3/4, and there is 1 plant length that is 6 3/4. So that tells me that I'm going to have 2 X's above the 6 1/4 mark. I'm going to have 3 X's above the 6 1/2 mark, 2 X's for the 5 3/4 mark, and 1 X for the 6 3/4 mark. So remember, each X mark in this example represents 1 plant length. And so for the ones that repeat, I'm going to have that number of X's above each of the markings. Again, another way to double check is you notice that you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 8 plants, again, 8 plant lengths. And so you will want to have 8 X's when you are done with your line plot. So that's an easy way to double check to make sure you didn't miss any. Okay, that completes our lesson for today. I'm going to go ahead and assign you your practice pages. Your practice pages, again, they might be already pulled from your booklet, so look for any loose pages in your bags. But you are going to be completing pages 283 and 284. That's one double-sided page. And 285 and 286, that's another double-sided page. So there's 2 parts again to this lesson. There's the measurement part as well as the line plot part. So you'll have 1 practice page that's practicing with measuring and 1 practice page that is practicing with line plots. Okay, I hope you got something out of this lesson. If you have any questions, stick around afterwards and I will be happy to answer them during my office hours. I hope that you guys, even if you don't have questions, will just check in and say hi. I miss you. I hope you guys are doing well. Hang in there. You guys are doing awesome. I love you. Miss you all. Bye.